The reading of the will was set for 11, and by 10:30, the long gallery at Wedderburn Hall was already full of people who believed they knew exactly how the morning would end. They sat in the good chairs, the ones drawn up from the dining room and arranged in 2 neat rows before the solicitor's table, and they wore their grief the way they wore their jewels, openly and for effect. At the far end of the room beyond the last row, in a hard chair that had been carried in as an afterthought and set against the wall beneath a window that did not quite close, sat a young woman in a gray gown nobody recognized as new because it was not new. Her name was Honora Vale, and to the assembled family of the late Sir Edmund Castleton she was the poor relation, the cousin's daughter taken in out of duty, the quiet one who fetched and carried and was thanked by no one. She had folded her hands in her lap. She was waiting, as she had learned to wait, without appearing to want anything at all. What none of them knew, what not one of the well-dressed mourners in the good chairs could have guessed, was that the old man they had come to bury had spent the last winter of his life writing letters he never sent, and that one of those letters would change the shape of every life in the room before the clock struck noon. The gallery smelled of beeswax and lilies and the particular cold of a great house in late autumn. Rain moved against the tall windows in slow gray sheets. Honora watched it rather than the family, because watching the family invited their notice, and their notice was never kind. She had lived at Wedderburn Hall for 11 years, since the spring she turned 15, and her father's small estate was sold to pay his small debts, and she was sent north in a hired coach with 1 trunk, and a letter of introduction that called her a sensible girl. Sensible. She had built her whole life on that word. She had made herself useful and made herself quiet. And in 11 years she had learned every cold corridor and every warm one. And she had learned which of her relations to avoid, and which merely to endure. At the front of the room sat Lady Castleton, Sir Edmund's widow by his second marriage, a handsome woman of 50, who had buried 2 husbands and intended to bury no more on terms she had not set. Beside her sat her daughter Cordelia, 23, golden and certain, dressed in mourning that had cost more than Honora's entire wardrobe, and that suited her enormously. They had arranged themselves, mother and daughter, as the obvious center of the morning, and the rest of the family had arranged themselves around them, as iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, by a force they did not examine and could not have resisted. To Lady Castleton, Honora was a fixture, like the long case clock or the portrait of the 3rd Baronet. She spoke to the girl when she required something carried or copied or counted, and otherwise she did not speak to her at all. That morning, settling her skirts, she had glanced once down the length of the gallery and found Honora in her hard chair by the draughty window, and she had said to her daughter, in the carrying voice of a woman who does not trouble to lower it, that it was good of Mr. Grex Pickering to allow the companion to sit in. The companion. The word had traveled the length of the room, and Honora had received it the way she received all such words, without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she had given up years ago. There was one other person in the gallery who did not belong to the family, and he stood rather than sat near the door as though he had not decided whether to stay. He was perhaps 34, tall, with the kind of stillness that made other men's restlessness suddenly visible, and he was dressed in a dark coat of excellent cut and no ornament whatever. The family knew him slightly, and approved of him entirely, because he was Gabriel Thorne, the Earl of Ashworth, whose estate marched with Wedderburn for 3 miles along the river, and whose late friendship with Sir Edmund had been the talk of the county, for the simple reason that the Earl of Ashworth was friend to almost no one. He had come, it was understood, to pay his respects. He had not been expected to attend the reading. That he had remained for it was the kind of small irregularity that the family, intent on larger matters, did not pause to consider. Honora considered it. She considered it because she had spent 11 years reading rooms for her own safety, and a man who did not belong, standing where he might leave, was a thing worth watching. She had met him twice. Once in the library. 2 winters past, when she had been sent to find a volume Sir Edmund wanted and had found instead the Earl of Ashworth alone among the shelves, and he had asked her, not unkindly, whether she had read the book in her hand, and she had answered before she remembered to be quiet that she had, twice, and that the second half was better than the first. He had looked at her then for a moment longer than the exchange required. The second time had been in the rose garden in June, when she was cutting flowers for the dining room, and he had come upon her by the wall, and he had said nothing at all, only inclined his head, and she had thought afterward that there were men who could make silence feel like the opposite of dismissal, and that he was one of them. Mr. Pickering, the solicitor, arrived on the stroke of 11 with a black case and an expression of practiced neutrality. He was a small, dry, precise man who had served Sir Edmund for 30 years, and who had buried in that time a great many secrets on behalf of a great many families, and who understood better than anyone in the room that the chief function of a will is not to distribute property, but to reveal in a single irreversible morning what a man had actually believed about the people around him. He set out his papers, he asked for quiet, and received it instantly, because money has a way of producing silence that grief cannot. He began with the small bequests, as solicitors do, building from the bottom of the house upward to the housekeeper. Mrs. Dent, a sum and a cottage. To the steward, the same. To the gardener who had kept the roses 40 years, an annuity that made the old man, standing at the back, put his weathered hand over his mouth. The family listened to all this with the gracious patience of people waiting for the part that concerned them. Cordelia adjusted her glove. Lady Castleton held her chin at the angle of a woman receiving what is owed. If you have ever sat in a room where everyone believed they knew their place and watched that belief begin to crack, you will know the particular quality of the silence that came next. Stay with me, because this is where the morning turned. Mr. Pating. Pickering came to the matter of Wedderburn Hall itself, the house and its lands and the greater part of the fortune. And here he paused and adjusted his spectacles, and read in the same dry voice he had used for the gardener's annuity that the estate, being unentailed, Sir Edmund had been free to dispose of as he saw fit, and that he had seen fit to dispose of it in a manner that Mr. Pickering would now read in the testator's own words. Lady Castleton's chin came down a fraction. This was not the customary phrasing. This was not the smooth and expected transfer of a great house to a widow and her daughter. Something in the solicitor's care had alerted the animal part of her that lived beneath the diamonds, and Honora, watching from the window, saw the woman's gloved hand close slowly upon her fan. The Earl of Ashworth by the door did not move at all. Honora, however, who had spent 2 years learning the particular stillness of him, saw that it had changed. It had become the stillness of a man who knows what is in a letter before it is opened. Mr. Pickering read, "The bulk of the estate of the late Sir Edmund Castleton, the house known as Wedderburn Hall, its lands, its rents, the funds in the 3%, the contents of the house, excepting those items already named, were left entire and without condition to Honora Vale, daughter of his late cousin Thomas Vale, who had been, the testator's own words said, the only person beneath his roof in 11 years who had asked him how he did, and waited for the answer." For the length of one heartbeat, the gallery held perfectly still, the way a wine glass holds its shape in the instant after it has been struck and before it shatters. Then it shattered. Cordelia made a small sound. Not quite a word. Lady Castleton came to her feet so quickly, her chair scraped the floor like a cry, and the rest of the family broke into the low, urgent murmur of people whose entire understanding of the world has been overturned between one sentence and the next. And Honora sat very still in her hard chair by the draughty window, with her hands folded in her lap, and discovered that she could not feel her own face. She had not asked. That was the first coherent thought to arrive, and it arrived with the force of grief rather than joy, because she had not asked. She had never asked. She had made an art and a religion of not asking, and the old man had seen her anyway. He had seen her in the 11 years she believed she had been invisible. He had heard her, those evenings she sat with him when no one else would, reading aloud from the books he could no longer hold, asking him how he did, and waiting, actually waiting, for the answer, because it had seemed to her a small enough kindness to give a dying man whom everyone else had already finished with. She had not done it to be seen. She had done it because it was right. And now the doing of it had set her in the center of a room that had spent 11 years deciding she did not exist. And the room was looking at her, all of it. And the looking was not kind. Lady Castleton found her voice first. She did not raise it. She had learned long ago that a lowered voice cuts deeper, and she turned upon the solicitor the full force of her displeasure, and said that there had plainly been some imposition upon a sick old man, some manipulation by a person who had insinuated herself into a position of trust, and that the family would of course contest a document so manifestly the product of a failing mind. The word she did not say, but built the whole speech around, was a word Honora had heard before in that house, the word for a woman who takes what is not hers, by arts that have nothing to do with merit, and the family heard it in the spaces between the words she did say, and some of them nodded. Mr. Furse. Pickering, who had drawn wills for testators a great deal madder than Sir Edmund, and seen them stand, replied that the testator had been examined by 2 physicians within the month, before signing that both had attested to his soundness of mind in documents Mr. Granger. Pickering held in his case, and that he would be happy to produce them at any proceeding the family cared to bring. He said this in the manner of a man laying out cutlery, and the precision of it landed in the room like cold water. Yet Lady Castleton was not a woman to be governed by documents she had not yet seen, and she gathered her daughter and her allies with a glance, and made it understood, without another vulgar word, that this was not finished, that a girl who had come to this house with one trunk would not leave it with a fortune, that the matter would be set right by people who understood how the world was meant to run. Honora rose. She did not know she meant to until she had done it. She crossed the length of the gallery between the 2 rows of staring faces, past Cordelia's frozen beauty and her aunt's cold fury, and she stopped before Mr. Bree, Pickering's table, and in a voice that shook only slightly, she said that she wished to be quite sure she had understood, that she had not known, and that she had never once asked Sir Edmund for anything at all. It was not a defense. She did not yet understand that she would need a defense. It was only the truth, offered plainly, because the truth was the only thing she had ever owned outright, and she did not intend to part with it now. It was then that the Earl of Ashworth crossed the room. He did it without hurry. 3 unhurried strides from the door to the solicitor's table, and the family, who had been preparing to close upon the girl like a hand closing upon a moth, found their attention pulled to him instead because a man of his rank moving deliberately is a thing a Regency drawing-room cannot ignore. He came to a halt beside Honora, not before her, not shielding her, only beside her, as a man stands beside an equal, and he addressed himself to Mr. Porty, Pickering, and to the room behind him, and he said that he had been present 8 months before, when Sir Edmund had spoken to him of his intentions, and that the old man had been as sound of mind as any man in the county, and that he, Ashworth, would so testify in any court in England. The room received this in silence. It was one thing for a paid solicitor to defend a document that paid him. It was another thing entirely for the Earl of Ashworth, who wanted nothing, who needed nothing, who had been friend to a dead man and was beholden to no living one, to set his name and his word in the scale, on the side of a girl in a grey gown. Lady Castleton looked at him with an expression in which calculation was rapidly replacing fury, because she was recalculating in that moment the cost of a fight that now had the Earl of Ashworth standing in it, and the recalculation did not please her. Honora looked up at him. She had not asked for this either. And she found, looking at the side of his face, at the jaw set hard and the grey eyes fixed on the solicitor, that she did not know how to thank a man for a thing she had not requested and could not repay, and so she said nothing. And he, as though he heard the nothing and understood it, inclined his head a 1/4 inch, the same gesture he had given her in the rose garden in June. The family withdrew within the hour, Lady Castleton, last of all, pausing at the gallery door to look back at the girl who now owned the floor she stood upon, and the look she gave was the look of a general surveying a field she has lost but does not yet concede. Then the great door closed behind them, and the house that had been full of voices was suddenly, enormously, quiet. And Honora stood in the long gallery that belonged to her now, and felt the silence press against her like a weight she did not know how to carry. She did not sleep that night. She walked the corridors. She had walked for 11 years as a servant in all but name, and she found that ownership had changed nothing she could see, and everything she could not. The portraits looked down at her with the same painted indifference. The clock kept the same time. The cold corridor outside the late baronet's study, where she had so often stood waiting to be summoned or dismissed, did not summon or dismiss her now, and she stood in it a long while in the dark, and she understood that the house had not been given to her so much as set upon her, and that she would have to learn to bear it. In the morning, a letter came from the Earl of Ashworth. It was brief, and it was not the letter of a suitor, which was a relief, and in some corner of herself she did not examine. A disappointment. He wrote that the family would almost certainly bring a suit to overturn the will, that they would attack her character, because they could not attack the document, and that she would do well to engage counsel of her own, at once, rather than rely upon Mr. Dewar. Pickering, whose interest, though honest, was in the will and not in her, he named a man in London. He offered, in a single sentence at the close, his assistance in any particular she might require, and he signed himself her servant, Ashworth, which was the form everyone used and meant nothing, and which Honora read 4 times anyway. She wrote back that she was grateful for his counsel, and would act upon it, and that she could not think why he should trouble himself on her behalf. And she sent the letter before she could soften the last line, because she had decided, somewhere in the long, sleepless night, that she was done being grateful for crumbs, and afraid of the consequences of asking. Plainly, she had a house. She had, apparently, a fortune. She had spent 11 years being the companion, the poor relation, the sensible girl, and she found she had very little practice at being a woman who said what she meant. She meant to acquire the practice. His reply came by return. He troubled himself, he wrote, because Sir Edmund had been the only man in the county who had spoken to him as though he were a person and not a rank, and because he had watched, over 2 years of dinners and libraries and 1 June afternoon in a rose garden, a young woman do the same thing, and he had formed the opinion that the world was wrong about her. In a way, the world was frequently wrong, about people it had decided not to look at. He did not say more than that. It was, Honora thought, a great deal more than nothing, and she pressed the letter flat with her hand on the writing desk, and sat for a long moment with her palm upon it, as though it might warm her, which it did not, and which, in another way, entirely it did. The suit came, as he had said it would. Lady Castleton engaged the most expensive counsel in the north, and let it be known throughout the county that the new mistress of Wedderburn was an adventuress who had preyed upon a failing old man, and the county, which loved Lady Castleton no more than it loved anyone, but loved a fortune and feared her displeasure, repeated the word from house to house until it had the weight of established fact. Invitations that might have come did not come. A woman who had been merely invisible found herself something worse. A subject, discussed in drawing rooms she had never entered, condemned by people who had never spoken a word to her. It was at the assembly rooms in the county town, 3 weeks into the suit, that the word was spoken to her face. She had gone because her new counsel from London had advised her to be seen, to give the lie to the charge of hiding, to walk into the world as a woman with nothing to conceal. She had worn a gown of deep green that was the first thing she had ever bought purely because it pleased her, and she had walked into the long assembly room on no one's arm, and the room had performed the small, cruel ballet of turning very slightly away. And Cordelia Castleton, golden in the candlelight, surrounded by the friends of fortune purchases, had said, not quite quietly enough, to the young man beside her, that it took a particular sort of nerve for an adventuress to dress so, and the word had carried, as Cordelia had intended it to carry, across the polished floor to where Honora stood. She did not turn. She had learned, long ago, the precise discipline of not turning. Her breath had caught once sharply beneath the green silk, and her hand had risen halfway to her throat before she stilled it. And these small betrayals of the body she could not entirely govern, because the body keeps its own accounts and settles them when it chooses. She stood in the center of the unkind room, and she made herself breathe. And she thought that she had owned a great house for 3 weeks, and was poorer in the world's regard than she had been as the companion in the gray gown, and that there was a lesson in that she did not yet have the strength to learn. A voice beside her said quietly that the green became her, and that she should not give the room the satisfaction of seeing it land. It was Ashworth. She had not seen him arrive. He stood beside her as he had stood beside her in the gallery, not before her and not shielding her, only beside her. And he did not look at Cordelia, and did not raise his voice, and he asked her, in the same level tone, whether she would do him the honor of the next dance. It was not a rescue. He was too careful a man to rescue her, because a rescue would have confirmed the room's verdict that she required rescuing. It was an invitation between equals, offered in the full sight of everyone who had turned away, and when she put her gloved hand in his, and he led her onto the floor, the room's slight turning away faltered and reversed, because the Earl of Ashworth did not dance. The county knew he did not dance. He had not danced since before his wife died. And yet here he was. Leading the adventuress onto the floor with the grave courtesy he showed to duchesses. They did not speak for the first turn. His hand at her waist was correct, and light, and unhurried. She was aware of exactly where it rested, in a way that traveled up through her. In a slow, bright line. She had no name for, and was afraid to name. She was aware of the warmth of him, of the clean smell of him, of the fact that she came barely to his shoulder, and that this, which should have made her feel small, did not. On the second turn, he said, looking somewhere over her head, with the particular concentration of a man choosing his words, that she should know the thing the room knew and used against him, since she had given him her hand in front of all of them, and deserved not to be the only one exposed. And then, quietly, in the middle of a country dance with 40 people pretending not to watch, the Earl of Ashworth told her about his wife. Her name had been Eleanor. They had married young, a match of estates and not of feeling, and feeling had come later and unevenly, more on his side than hers. And he had been a poor husband, absent and proud and certain. There would be time to become a better one. She had died in childbed in the 3rd year, and the child with her, a daughter, and he had been in London on a matter of business he could no longer remember the substance of, and he had come home to a house with 2 new graves in the churchyard and a nursery that had been prepared and would never be used. He had told no one the whole of it. He told her now in fragments between the figures of the dance, because the dance gave him somewhere to put his hands and his eyes while he said the unsayable, and because, he said, she had spent 11 years being looked through and would understand, better than anyone in the room, what it was to carry a thing no one bothered to see. The coldness the county admired in him, the discipline, the silence, was the shape grief takes in a man who has decided he is not permitted to put it down. Honora listened and did not offer comfort, because she understood that comfort was the last thing he wanted, and that what he wanted was simply to have said it aloud to someone who would not flinch and would not pity and would not repeat it. And when the dance ended, she did not let go of his hand at once, and he did not withdraw it. And for a moment, they stood at the edge of the floor in the bright, cruel room as though they were entirely alone in it, and the room saw, and the room began, against its own will, to wonder whether it had been wrong. The winter deepened. The suit ground forward through its expensive stages. Ashworth's testimony, given to our London counsel and reduced to a sworn statement, was a wall the Castletons' lawyers could not get around, and the 2 physicians' attestations were a second wall, and Lady Castleton's case, which rested entirely upon the proposition that Sir Edmund had been mad or imposed upon, to the county that had been so eager to believe it, increasingly, like the spite of a woman cheated of an expectation, rather than the just complaint of a family wronged. Lady Castleton had one card she had not yet played, however, and she played it in December. And it was the cruelest card in the pack, because it did not concern the will at all. There was a tenant on the Wedderburn lands, a widow named Mrs. Hale with 3 young children, whose cottage had flooded in the autumn rains, and whose rent Honora had quietly forgiven, and whose roof Honora had quietly paid to mend, telling no one because she had learned charity in a school that taught it was best done in silence. Lady Castleton, through a steward who still owed her loyalty, learned of it and twisted it, and let it be understood that the new mistress of Wedderburn was buying the loyalty of the poor to bolster her position, that the forgiven rent was a bribe, that the mended roof was a calculation. It was a small lie and a stupid one, but it was aimed with great precision at the one part of Honora's character she had believed unassailable, and it found her in the worst possible way, because Mrs. A. Hale, frightened and confused, and got at, was made to say, before witnesses Lady Castleton had arranged, that the lady at the hall had asked her to speak well of her in the town. Honora heard of it on a grey morning, when her London counsel's letter and Lady Castleton's triumph arrived almost together, and for the first time since the reading of the will, she felt the ground go entirely out from under her. It was one thing to be called an adventuress for taking a fortune. She could bear the world's belief that she had schemed for money, because she knew it was false and the knowledge was armor. To have her one true thing, the charity she had done in silence and for no reward, turned inside out and made into evidence of the very calculation she had spent her life refusing, this struck at something beneath the armor, and she sat at the writing desk in the study that had been Sir Edmund's, and put her face in her hands. And for a long while she did not move at all. She did not write to Ashworth. That was the measure of how far she had fallen, that in the worst hour she did not reach for the one hand that had been offered, because the lie had done its true work, which was to make her doubt that any kindness shown her could be free of motive, including her own, including his. If the world could make her quiet charity into calculation, then perhaps everything was calculation. Perhaps his standing beside her in the gallery and on the dance floor had been the move of a man who pitied her, or who liked the look of a noble gesture, and she could not bear in that hour to test it and find it true. So she sat alone in the great house she had been given and had never wanted, and she let the lie win, because she was tired, and because 11 years of being told she was nothing had built in her a foundation the lie knew exactly how to find. It was Mrs. Dent, the housekeeper, who would not let her stay there. The old woman came into the study without knocking, which she had never done, and set down a cup of tea Honora had not asked for, and said, in the plain, flat voice of a woman who had served the house 40 years, and feared no one in it, that she had known Miss Vale 11 years, and had watched her sit with the old master every evening when his own people would not, and that, whatever the town was saying, she, Dent, knew the difference between a kindness and a bribe, having received a great many of the first and not one of the second from Miss Vale's hand. And then she said the thing that moved Honora to her feet. She said that Mrs. Hale was beside herself, that she had been frightened into her words and regretted them the instant they were out of her mouth, that she had a paper she wished to swear to the truth and no one to take her to a magistrate, and that if Miss Vale meant to sit in this study and let a frightened widow be made the instrument of her ruin, then she was not the woman Dent had taken her for these 11 years. Honora went to Mrs. Hale that afternoon. She went alone, in the rain, in the green gown she had worn to the assembly, because it had become to her a kind of standard. She found the widow in the mended cottage with her 3 children, wretched and ashamed, and she did not reproach her, because she understood being frightened into a false thing better than Lady Castleton would ever understand it. She sat at the woman's poor table, and she listened. And Mrs. Blang Hale told her the whole of it, the steward's visit, the careful questions, the way her fear for her children had been used as a lever, and she said that she would swear the truth before any magistrate in England if Miss Vale would only stand with her while she did it, because she was afraid, and a frightened woman alone before the law is a fragile thing. But 2 frightened women together are a great deal harder to break. They went the next morning to the magistrate, who was an old friend of Sir Edmund's, and no friend at all, of Lady Castleton's, and Mrs. Hale swore her true account, and it was written down and witnessed, and the false statement Lady Castleton had been so proud of turned to ash in her hand. Honora did not stop there. She had learned something in the cottage and on the cold road home, something the 11 silent years had not been able to teach her, which was that there is a courage that consists not in enduring quietly, but in standing up in the full sight of the world and saying, in a plain voice, "This is the truth." And she resolved that she would not wait for the suit to grind to its slow conclusion in a courtroom no one would see. She would answer the lie in the same arena it had been told. She would go to the Christmas assembly, the great one, the whole county under one roof, and she would stand in the room where Cordelia had called her an adventuress. And she would let the county see exactly who she was. The Christmas assembly at the county town was the largest gathering of the season, and every family of consequence for 30 miles attended it, and Lady Castleton attended it as she attended everything, in the certainty that she was its rightful center. She had not expected Honora to come. When the new mistress of Wedderburn entered the long, bright room on no one's arm, in the deep green gown with her head level and her hands steady, a current went through the assembly that stilled the music for half a beat, and Lady Castleton, across the room, set down her glass. Honora did not go to her at once. She moved through the room as a woman with a right to be in it, and she greeted the magistrate who greeted her warmly, and she greeted Mrs. Dent's nephew, who farmed near the town, and she let the room observe that she was neither hiding nor afraid. And then when the moment had ripened, when the room's attention had gathered upon her the way it gathers upon anyone who refuses to behave as expected, she crossed the floor to where Lady Castleton stood with Cordelia and her allies, and she stopped at a proper and public distance, and she spoke in a voice pitched to Carrie, because she had spent 11 years being unheard, and she did not intend to be unheard now. She said that she understood a statement had been obtained from a tenant of hers, a widow with 3 children, to the effect that she had purchased the woman's good opinion. She said that the statement had been sworn false before the magistrate 2 days past, and that the magistrate held Mrs. Hale's true account, and that any person who cared for the truth might apply to him for it. She said that she had forgiven the widow's rent and mended the widow's roof and had asked for nothing and told no one, and that she would do it again tomorrow, and that if the county wished to call a mended roof a bribe, then the county had a poorer understanding of charity than a flooded widow with 3 hungry children. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She laid the truth out plainly on the polished floor between them, the way Mr. Pickering had laid out his cutlery, and the room went very still, and Lady Castleton's face, for the first time in Honora's 11 years of watching it, did not know what arrangement to make of itself. It was into that stillness that the Earl of Ashworth came. He had been at the far end of the room, and he crossed it now, the whole length of it, with every eye upon him. And he came to a halt beside Honora, and he turned to face the room, and he said, in the level voice that carried without effort to its furthest corner, a single thing, and he said it once. He said that Miss Vale had consented to become his wife. The room did not breathe. Cordelia's painted certainty cracked clean across. Lady Castleton put out one hand to the back of a chair and held it, and the calculation behind her eyes ran fast and found at the end of it nothing, because there is no arithmetic that turns the betrothed wife of the Earl of Ashworth into an adventuress. And every soul in the room performed the same swift sum and reached the same answer in the same instant, and the verdict of the county, which had been rendered against a girl in a gray gown, reversed itself between one heartbeat and the next in the very room where it had first been spoken. Honora turned to look at him. He had not asked her. He had said it as a fact accomplished, in front of the entire county, and she understood that he had done it this way on purpose, that a private proposal could be doubted and a public one could not, that he had taken the most expensive thing he owned, which was his name, and spent it openly to overturn a lie. The way she had spent her silence and her charity, and that it was, in its way, the most honest thing a careful man could do. And she understood that she could refuse him, here, now in front of everyone, and that he had made himself vulnerable to exactly that, because a man who declares a betrothal that has not occurred has placed his pride entirely in the hands of the woman beside him. She did not refuse him. She put her hand in his, in the full sight of the county, and she said clearly that she had, and that she was glad of it. And the 2 true sentences landed in the room like the first 2 stones of a wall. And the Earl of Ashworth, who did not smile, who the county would have sworn could not smile, looked down at her and let the corner of his hard mouth move, once the smallest possible amount. And it was the most that anyone present had ever seen of his heart. And it was for her. Lady Castleton withdrew the suit within the week. There was no profit in it now, and a great deal of cost, and she was, whatever else she was, a woman who could read a ledger. She did not apologize because women like Lady Castleton do not apologize. But she let it be known that she had perhaps been hasty, that grief had perhaps clouded her judgment, that she wished her late husband's heir every happiness. And the county which had so eagerly repeated her lie now as eagerly repeated her retreat. And the word adventurous was not heard again in any drawing-room where Honora might enter. Cordelia married in the spring, a baronet with a smaller fortune than she had been raised to expect, and was by all accounts not unhappy. And Honora, who had every reason to wish her ill, found that she did not, because a woman, secure in her own worth, has no appetite for the diminishment of others. They were married quietly at the parish church near Wedderburn, on a clear, cold morning in February, with the river running high and bright below the churchyard, and the bare trees black against a sky the color of pearl. Mrs. Dent wept. The gardener who had kept the roses 40 years stood at the back. In his good coat, Mrs. Hale brought her 3 children, scrubbed and solemn, and the youngest carried a posy of the late Rose's hips and winter greenery that she had clearly been told not to drop, and dropped twice. There was no crowd and no spectacle. Honora had had enough of being a spectacle, and so had he, and they had agreed without quite discussing it that the public part of their life was finished and the private part might now begin. That evening they sat together in the library at Ashworth, the room where she had first met him among the shelves. 2 winters passed, and the fire was high, and the snow had begun to fall against the tall windows, slow and steady and silent. The first real snow of the year. She had brought one thing with her from Wedderburn, one thing only, out of the whole great house that had been given to her, and she set it now upon the table between them. It was a small worn volume, the book she had been reading aloud to Sir Edmund in the last weeks of his life, the one she had not finished because he had died before the final chapter, and inside the cover, in the old man's failing hand, was written a line she had not found until after the will was read, a line that said simply that she had been the best company of his last years, and that he hoped the house would teach her, as it had never taught his own blood, that she was worth a great deal more than she had been told. She opened it to the place they had stopped, and she read aloud to her husband the chapter the old man had not lived to hear, and the Earl of Ashworth sat back in the firelight and closed his eyes and listened, and the grief he had carried so long sat lighter on him than it had in years, because grief shared is not grief halved, but it is grief witnessed. And he had spent a long time being unwitnessed, and so had she. The snow came down. The fire settled. And in the warm room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, a poor relation who had once sat in the corner of a great cold gallery, asking nothing, expecting nothing, read the last chapter of a dead man's book to the living man who had chosen her, and was, at last, exactly where she belonged. Thank you for staying to the end of her story.